Look in the mirror right now. If your eyes are green, you are looking at something that should not exist by the normal rules of biology, and for most of human history, nobody could tell you why. On a winter morning in 1985, a photographer in a refugee camp in Peshawar, Pakistan pointed his camera at a 12-year-old girl wrapped in a torn red shawl. And the moment her eyes locked onto the lens, he knew he had captured something the world had never fully understood. That single photograph would end up on the cover of one of the most widely read magazines on the planet, and for decades afterward, people stared at those sea green eyes without knowing that they were staring at the tail end of a genetic journey that started thousands of miles away and thousands of years earlier. That girl's name was Sharbat Gula, and her eyes were not a coincidence. They were evidence of a secret written into human DNA that scientists only fully cracked open in the last 20 years. And if your own eyes are green, that same secret is sitting inside every cell of your body right now, whether you knew it or not. Before we go further, if you have green eyes, or you're itching to find out where a trait like this really came from, hit subscribe, because this channel exists to dig through the hidden history buried inside your genes, the kind of story no cheek swab ancestry kit will ever print out for you. Now let's get into exactly how rare this is, because the numbers alone are enough to stop you in your tracks. Roughly 70 to 75% of every human being alive has brown eyes. It is, by a huge margin, the default setting for our species, and in large parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, the number climbs even closer to 100%. Blue eyes are the famous runner-up, heavily concentrated across Northern and Eastern Europe, especially in countries like Estonia, where surveys have found the vast majority of the population carries some form of light-colored eyes, with some estimates placing that figure well above 80%, making it one of the highest concentrations of light-eyed people found anywhere on Earth. But green does something neither of those colors does. It refuses to cluster in any one obvious place, and it refuses to be common almost anywhere. Depending on which population study you look at, green eyes appear in somewhere between 2 and 3% of people on the entire planet, which means in a room of 100 strangers, you might only find 2 or 3 who share what you see in the mirror. In certain countries, an entire lifetime could pass without ever standing face to face with a green-eyed stranger. Interestingly, green often gets confused with hazel, which is technically its own distinct category, a warmer blend of brown, gold, and green that shifts noticeably depending on the light, whereas true green tends to stay remarkably consistent, no matter the lighting around it. That kind of scarcity is precisely why humans spent thousands of years inventing stories instead of explanations. Ancient and medieval cultures did not have chromosomes or pigment charts, so when something this rare showed up, they filled in the blank with fear. In parts of medieval Europe, a green-eyed woman could find herself whispered about as a witch, purely because her eyes did not match anyone else's in the village. Folklore across the Mediterranean and the Middle East linked light and green eyes to the evil eye, a belief that a certain kind of gaze could curse crops, animals, or newborn children, which is part of why charms and amulets meant to ward off the evil eye are still sold in markets from Turkey to Greece today. Green eyes also became tangled up with jealousy and envy in the English language itself. Shakespeare wrote about the green-eyed monster in Othello, and the phrase green with envy has survived for centuries, all rooted in a superstition that green-eyed people were somehow more prone to covetous or suspicious natures. Travelers who encountered green-eyed strangers on long journeys sometimes described them almost like a separate breed of human, exotic and slightly unsettling, simply because the trait was so uncommon back home. For thousands of years, that was the best explanation anyone had. It took modern genetics to finally replace centuries of superstition with something far stranger and far more astonishing than any legend. It also helps to understand where green eyes physically cluster today, because the map is anything but random. The single highest concentrations of green and light-colored eyes on Earth are found in the far north and west of Europe, especially Ireland and Scotland, where a striking share of the population carries some version of green or hazel eyes alongside the more famous blue. Move south and east across the European continent, and the percentage steadily drops, and by the time you reach East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or the indigenous populations of the Americas, green eyes become almost vanishingly rare, often appearing only in populations with some degree of mixed or European ancestry. That uneven distribution is not an accident of nature. It is a fossil record, a trail left behind by one specific ancient migration that we are about to trace step by step. Eye color, it turns out, is basically a quiet map of human movement stamped directly onto faces instead of onto stone or parchment. Here's the first fact that should genuinely mess with how you see your own reflection. Your green eyes are not actually green. There is no green pigment anywhere inside the human eye. Not one molecule of it exists in nature's paint box for the iris. If a scientist took a green iris apart at the molecular level and searched for a green dye, they would come back with absolutely nothing, because the color you are seeing is not a substance at all. It is a trick, one of the strangest optical illusions built directly into human biology. And once you understand how it works, you will never look at eye color the same way again. The entire story comes down to a single pigment called melanin, the same substance responsible for the color of your skin and hair. Melanin in the human iris only ever comes in shades of brown and black, nothing else. A heavy concentration of melanin in the front layer of the iris produces dark brown eyes. A somewhat lighter concentration produces hazel or amber tones. But when melanin drops to a very low level, something else entirely takes over the process. Something that has nothing to do with pigment and everything to do with physics. Light entering the eye passes through the iris and gets scattered by the tissue itself, and the shorter wavelengths of light, the blues, bounce back out toward the observer, while the longer, warmer wavelengths get absorbed by the darker layer sitting behind the iris. This is called Tyndall scattering, and it is the exact same physical principle that makes the daytime sky appear blue, even though the atmosphere itself has no blue pigment floating inside it. So a blue-eyed person is not showing you a blue substance. They are showing you scattered light, quite literally the same optical trick that colors the sky above your head. Every blue-eyed and green-eyed person on this planet is, in a very real sense, carrying a small fragment of the sky inside their own skull. So where does green actually come from if blue is just scattered light and brown is just heavy pigment? Green sits precisely in the middle, and it is a far more delicate recipe than either of its neighbors. Green eyes occur when that same blue scattering effect from a low melanin iris combines with a thin extra layer of a yellowish pigment called lipochrome sitting on top of it. The eye is essentially blending blue light from scattering with a wash of gold from the lipochrome, and your brain interprets that combination as green. It is, quite literally, a living optical illusion happening inside your own head every time you look at someone with green eyes. For this to work, melanin has to land in an extremely narrow window, not so much that it drowns the effect into brown, and not so little that it collapses into pure blue. That narrow window is exactly why green eyes are so rare compared to blue. Blue eyes are essentially the default result of very low melanin, almost an absence of pigment, allowing scattering to take over uncontested. Green demands an entire additional ingredient layered on top at a very specific dose, which is why blue eyes can dominate whole nations, while green eyes remain stubbornly uncommon even in the very countries where they show up most. Now for the part that turns this from a curiosity into something genuinely historic. If eye color depends on such a fragile, narrow combination of pigment and light, the obvious question is what part of your DNA actually controls it? And the answer leads straight into one of the most remarkable genetic discoveries of the last 2 decades. 2 genes sit at the center of this story. The first is called OCA2, and you can think of it as the body's melanin factory, since it plays the leading role in determining how much pigment gets deposited into the iris. The second gene is called HERK2, and this is the real key to the entire mystery. HERK2 does not manufacture pigment itself. Instead, it functions like a regulatory switch, sitting extremely close to OCA2 on the same chromosome. And it has the power to turn that melanin factory up or down depending on a tiny variation buried inside its code. In 2008, a research team at the University of Copenhagen, led by geneticist Hans Eiberg, published a study that would change how scientists understood eye color forever. By mapping the DNA of a large 3-generation Danish family in which eye color varied between relatives, the team narrowed the search down to a specific stretch inside HERK2, and eventually to one single letter change in the genetic code, a variant now cataloged as RS.2991388832. That tiny switch sits inside an intron of RC2 in a segment that acts as a control element for the neighboring OCA2 gene, and it significantly reduces how active that melanin factory becomes. When the team compared this exact genetic switch across blue-eyed individuals from countries as far apart as Denmark, Turkey, and Jordan, they found something that stopped them cold. Nearly every blue-eyed person carried the identical version of that switch, in the identical location, changed in the identical way, not a similar mutation. The exact same one, letter for letter. There is really only one explanation for a pattern like that. A mutation that shows up independently in unrelated populations almost never lands on the precise same spot in the precise same way, because random mutations are, by their nature, random. But when the exact same change appears across wildly separated populations, the only reasonable conclusion is that it happened a single time, in a single person, and then rode down through that person's descendants across thousands of years and thousands of miles. Professor Eiberg and his colleagues concluded that every blue-eyed person alive today can trace that particular switch back to one common ancestor who lived somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, most likely in the region near the Black Sea, along the borderlands where Eastern Europe meets Western Asia. That same Ars 291832 marker turned out to be so reliable that forensic geneticists now use it, alongside a handful of related markers, in DNA phenotyping systems designed to predict a suspect's eye color directly from crime scene evidence, decades after the original crime took place. This person left behind no writing, no monument, and almost certainly no idea that a small copying error in their DNA would eventually be carried inside the eyes of hundreds of millions of people who would never know their name. Green eyes tell a slightly more complicated version of the same story, because green is not simply that one switch, it is that switch working alongside additional genetic variation in OCA2 itself, plus the added lipochrome layer, plus a finer degree of tuning across several supporting genes. So green did not appear out of nowhere either. It grew directly out of that same ancient light eye mutation from the Black Sea region, then continued to be shaped and refined as populations mixed, migrated, and intermarried across the following thousands of years. In a very real sense, every set of green eyes alive today is a record of movement, a living marker of what happened when that original mutation traveled far from its point of origin and combined with new genetic material along the way. Which raises an obvious question that puzzled scientists for years. A mutation that reduces pigment does not obviously make anyone stronger, faster, healthier, or better equipped to survive a harsh environment. In pure survival terms, it should have been a minor footnote that faded out within a few generations. Instead, it spread across an entire hemisphere. There are two leading explanations, and researchers increasingly believe both were operating at once. The first is tied to sunlight. As populations pushed north into regions with far weaker sun and long, dark winters, the same genetic machinery that lightens eye color also tends to lighten skin, and lighter skin allows the body to synthesize vitamin D more efficiently under low sunlight conditions. Eye color may have simply hitched a ride alongside a trait that carried a genuine survival advantage in colder, darker climates. The second explanation is more social than biological. In small, ancient communities where nearly everyone shared dark eyes, someone with a rare, striking eye color would have stood out immediately. And standing out has always mattered when it comes to attracting a partner and passing genes forward. Over enough generations, simply being memorable may have given this mutation just enough of an edge to keep spreading, rather than disappearing. Now let's follow that mutation on the journey that most people have never heard about, because the story does not stay contained in Europe. It travels east, deep into the heart of Asia. Around 5,000 years ago, a group known to archaeologists and geneticists as the Yamnaya, herders from the grasslands north of the Black Sea who had mastered horseback riding and long-distance travel across open steppe, began expanding outward in multiple directions at once. Some pushed west into the heart of Europe, contributing a massive share of the ancestry found in modern Europeans today. Others turned east and south, moving into Central Asia, along paths that would, thousands of years later, become part of the legendary trade network known as the Silk Road. These migrants carried their language, their livestock, their tools, and their genetics with them, including that same light eye mutation first traced back to the Black Sea region. The Silk Road itself, which connected China to the Mediterranean world for well over 1,000 years, was not a single road at all, but a sprawling web of overland routes threading through Central Asia. Merchants, soldiers, monks, and travelers moved constantly along these corridors, and wherever large numbers of people mix and intermarry over centuries, genes travel just as surely as silk, spices, and religious texts did. The light eye mutation that began on the western steppe steadily made its way into the mountain valleys and desert oases of Central and South Asia, and in a handful of isolated pockets, cut off from the surrounding world by mountains and distance, that trait became trapped, concentrated, and preserved rather than diluted. One of the most striking of these pockets sits deep in the mountains of northern Pakistan, in a remote region known as the Kalash Valley. The Kalash people, a small and distinct community numbering only a few thousand today, are famous for features that look startlingly different from their neighbors, including fair skin, lighter hair, and a strikingly high frequency of green and blue eyes. For generations, the most popular explanation offered by outsiders was a romantic one, that the Kalash were descended from stragglers of Alexander the Great's army, soldiers who marched east more than 2,000 years ago during his campaigns in Central and South Asia and never returned home, leaving their light-eyed bloodline behind in these mountains. It is a beautiful legend, and travel writers still repeat it today. When geneticists actually sequenced Kalash DNA, however, the legend mostly fell apart. Genetic studies indicate the Kalash population split off from other regional groups thousands of years before Alexander was ever born, meaning their light eyes did not arrive with a few wandering Macedonian soldiers at all. Instead, they trace back to that same deep well of ancient West Eurasian ancestry, the very stream that had already been carrying the light eye mutation eastward along the steppe and the Silk Road for millennia before any Greek empire existed. Their green eyes are not a souvenir of a famous conqueror, they are a genuine living fossil, a trait preserved in mountain isolation for so long that it outlasted every empire that later tried to claim credit for it. And the Kalash are far from alone. Scattered through the mountain valleys of Central and South Asia, in places like the Hans Valley, parts of Afghanistan, and the highlands of Nuristan and Chitral, green and light-colored eyes appear far more frequently than statistical models would ever predict for that part of the world. Each of these communities functions almost like a genetic time capsule, preserving an echo of a mutation that rolled through the region thousands of years ago and then became locked in place by geography. Since populations separated by high mountain passes and difficult terrain tend to marry within their own community generation after generation, rather than blending outward. In a well-connected, constantly mixing population, a rare trait tends to get diluted and fade toward the average over time. Wall a group off behind mountains for centuries, however, and a rare trait instead becomes concentrated, protected from the slow blending that erases it everywhere else. This brings us back to that photograph from 1984, taken in a Pakistani refugee camp near the Afghan border by photographer Steve McCurry, who had been sent by National Geographic to document the flood of refugees fleeing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Inside a makeshift school tent, he photographed a class of young Afghan girls, and one of them, orphaned at around age 6 and forced to walk with her siblings and grandmother across the mountains to reach safety in Pakistan, stared directly into his lens with a pair of piercing green eyes that seemed to carry the weight of everything her country had endured. That photograph ran on the cover of National Geographic in June of 1985 and became one of the most recognized portraits ever published, sometimes compared to the Mona Lisa for how it seemed to follow viewers with its gaze. For 17 years, nobody outside her own village knew her name. It was not until 2002 that McCurry, working with forensic and iris recognition experts, tracked her down again in a remote corner of Afghanistan and confirmed her identity as Sharbat Gula, by then a married mother of 3. Her striking eyes were not a random fluke plucked from nowhere. They were the visible endpoint of an invisible history. A mutation that began near the Black Sea, rode east across the open steppe with horse-riding herders, drifted along the Silk Road for 1,000 years, and finally surfaced in the face of a child photographed in a refugee camp in the mountains of Central Asia. She was not an exception to this story. In every meaningful sense, she was the story. So let's bring this all the way back to you and what any of this actually means if your own eyes happen to be green. It means you are carrying something genuinely ancient, tracing back further than any name in your family tree, further than any photograph your relatives ever kept, further than any country as it exists on a modern map. At some point, one of your ancestors picked up that original light eye mutation from the Black Sea region, or acquired the further combination of genetic changes needed to tip the color fully into green, and against overwhelming odds across thousands of years, that trait survived. It made it through countless generations, in which a single quiet twist of fate could have simply erased it. Every green-eyed person alive today is living proof that it did not disappear. Here is the part that tends to surprise people the most. That mutation does not respect any of the borders humans currently draw on maps. It does not care whether your ancestry is filed under European, Central Asian, or Middle Eastern on a modern census form. The same tiny genetic switch that shows up in a fishing village in Ireland also shows up in a mountain valley in Pakistan, in Turkey, in Denmark, in Afghanistan, and in Scotland. Green eyes are one of the clearest reminders available that the neat ancestral categories people use today are dramatically younger and dramatically shallower than the DNA sitting underneath them. A green-eyed woman in the Kalash Valley and a green-eyed man in rural Ireland are, in a very real and literal genetic sense, distant cousins, both carrying forward a gift passed down from the same long-forgotten ancestor. This is also exactly why a standard consumer ancestry test can feel simultaneously fascinating and frustrating. It might tell you that your background breaks down into a tidy pie chart of regional percentages, but it will rarely tell you the deeper journey your specific traits actually took to reach you. Your green eyes are the perfect example of this gap. A test might flag some general European ancestry and stop right there, without ever mentioning that the exact same underlying mutation is sitting inside mountain communities thousands of miles to the east, or that the whole story began with a single individual on the edge of Asia long before modern Europe, as we understand it today, ever existed. The percentages on the page are only the surface. The real inheritance is the deeper story buried underneath them, and that is the part almost nobody gets to hear. Before we close this out, a few more details are worth knowing because green eyes come bundled with some genuinely interesting side effects. Because green irises carry noticeably less melanin than brown ones, they allow slightly more light through, which can make green-eyed people a bit more sensitive to intense sunlight and glare. That is not a flaw at all, simply the same low pigment structure that produces the color showing up in a different form elsewhere. Researchers have also explored subtle links between eye color and other biological traits, including pain tolerance and alcohol sensitivity in some smaller studies, though this area of research remains young and should not be treated as settled science. What is solidly established, however, is the migration story itself, the shared genetic origin and the ancient timeline behind it, and That part of the story is remarkable enough entirely on its own. One final quirk worth knowing if you have ever wondered why your own eye color seemed to change as a child. A large number of babies are born with grayish or bluish eyes that are not their final color at all, simply because the melanin in the iris has not finished developing yet. Over the following months, and sometimes the first couple of years of life, pigment continues filling in gradually, and the eventual shade settles into place as that process completes. A baby who initially looks blue-eyed can slowly shift toward green as that final thin layer of lipochrome and melanin finishes forming, which means that, in a very real sense, you can watch this ancient genetic recipe finish cooking directly on an infant's face during their first year of life. It is the same recipe that began with one nameless person near the Black Sea, roughly 8,000 years ago, a recipe that crossed continents, empires, and thousands of generations, before quietly arriving, once again, in the mirror in front of you.